I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, Naturopathic Doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. Today we're going to talk all things mood and nutrition. We've talked about mood from lots of different perspectives when it comes to women's health. We've talked about the hormonal impact on mood. We've talked about the impact of insomnia and sleep disturbances on mood. But today we're going to talk specifically about nutrition and nutrients that are probably having an impact on your mental health and day-to-day mood. And I'm joined today by one of my colleagues and one of my friends, Dr. Stephanie Bayliss. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, Jordan. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
And Stephanie, I want you to introduce yourself. You're a naturopathic doctor and you practice in British Columbia. I'm staring at the hotel that you're sitting at right now in BC because you guys got snow.
Yes, we got snow and there's never snow here, or if there is snow, the city totally shuts down. So I'm currently trapped in a hotel room on Vancouver Island, I practice in Victoria, BC.
Awesome. And so I want us to, I would love to hear a little bit about your backstory. And even these are some things that I don't totally know about you, is how you came to be so interested in helping support people from a mental health perspective. I think sometimes as a practitioner, like we all know that like how influential mental health is in our patients' overall health and well-being. I don't think we can separate mental health from any other sphere of medicine, whether we were going to talk about autoimmunity or hormonal health or cancer care. And yet, this is not something that even as practitioners, I think sometimes we're even nervous about this particular area of a person's health and well-being, and may even, I think that probably leads to us under assessing and under supporting patients. Can you walk us through how you got to this spot in your career and why this is such an important area of medicine for you?
Yeah, definitely. So I started off my training at the University of Victoria and I did my undergrad in biopsychology. And I've always been very, very fascinated by the brain. I always was really taken with all of the neuroscience classes and everything all brain I was obsessed with. And so, all through my training and my undergrad, I was intending on going to med school. And that was really a huge part of what my undergrad was made up of, was the prerequisites for that program. And so through my own health journey, we'll call it, I became enamored with naturopathic medicine. And so I was very intrigued by this idea that there's other things that we can do to support our mood. Obviously, Jordan and I are going to talk today about how important medications are, but really there's so many other things that we can do to support mood. And so I basically went to school to become a naturopathic doctor, came out, landed myself in a pretty mental health focused practice. And that's basically been where I've been for the last 6 years. I would totally agree with you that I would say that a lot of practitioners across all disciplines are not totally comfortable supporting mental health. And it kind of ends up being a situation where there is some uncomfortableness and we don't know if we're going to say the wrong thing, and then that is under assessing and under treating. And so it's a very huge area of need. So I've loved it from the beginning. And it's very rewarding because there's so much of a positive impact that we can make.
And I think even just we're fortunate as naturopathic doctors, even the setup of us interacting with our patients probably lends itself to us having this. I'm going to use time is probably the most important thing when it comes to helping understand and assess what people are going through from a mental health perspective. I even think about my own physical exam, and my family doctor is great. But when it came to my mental health, we had a minute, right? And I was lucky that I knew what I was going in for. And I was like, I have PMDD. I'd like a 30-day supply of Prozac at 10 milligrams. And that was it. And I imagine if you didn't have that, right? And they said, well, how's your mood? You'd say, that's fine.
Totally. You wouldn't expand on it further because you wouldn't know what to say. And I think that's where the problem lies in healthcare where we're at right now is that 10 minutes is not enough to discuss mood. It's not even enough to discuss most things, but definitely not mood because there needs to be that safety, that therapeutic relationship forming, and you need to feel comfortable disclosing all those things that you just said.
Yeah. And like the follow-up questions were like, okay, are you sure you only need a 30-day supply and not a 60-day supply? Right. Like, and it really like I reflect on that often because when I think about the kind of bravery that it takes for people to even disclose that they're noticing, there's things about their mood that they're not happy with, or that it's not sitting, in their kind of like ideal situation, that to work up the bravery to be able to even disclose that, if that lands on a practitioner who has about 45 seconds to listen to you or who is not comfortable having that conversation, we can imagine what that does and what happens there, right?
Yeah, and it can make or break treatment outcomes for that individual, honestly. And like even if the medication is what's recommended or whatever, it's going to work better if there is that therapeutic relationship between the practitioner and the patient. And if that's not there, we know that like compliance with the medication or compliance with the treatment will drop off. The individual is less likely to think the treatment's going to work. They don't feel like their needs are being met or like their concerns have been heard. And so I think, yeah, obviously I'm biased as a naturopathic doctor, but I feel like we really have a unique role in this because we do have longer appointment times historically, and we take the time to develop that relationship with the patient.
So I know you have a unique framework of thinking about mental health and how to frame what options are available. And I do want to dive in and talk about the nutrition and nutritional interventions or even supplementation that supports mood. But before we get there, I imagine some of our listeners listening to this going like, I don't know if I have a problem with my mood. I'm just right. And I think we often sort of fill in the blanks with the things that we feel. I'm just tired. I'm just irritable. I'm just overworked. And I don't think we often can recognize mental health disturbances in ourselves. I think we imagine if we use the big D word and talk about depression, we imagine that person being, this like a vegetative human being who never gets out of bed. And so I do find that women have a hard time seeing depression in themselves because they have this vision of what it means to be depressed and they don't feel like they fit that definition. And yet, very often, if we start to dive into what people are experiencing, they are having low mood symptoms. How can someone start to recognize these things in themselves, that their mood is something that needs support?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and I would agree that's exactly what I see as well, is that people are just not sure. And so some of the things that we look for physical symptom wise is, sleeping maybe too much or not sleeping enough. So sleep kind of impacted in either direction. Poor appetite, changes in weight, again, in either direction. And then some of the more subjective symptoms would be, not enjoying the things that you usually enjoy, like maybe, taking your kids to do X, Y, or Z, or your job is no longer pleasurable or enjoyable when it used to be. Feelings of worthlessness, feelings of a lot of guilt that are not proportionate to the situation, poor concentration. And then, of course, the big one would be fatigue, like just feeling exhausted kind of all the time. And these things shouldn't be explainable by any other reason, right? So like not like you're hypothyroid or you are, undergoing like cancer care treatment, like you said before, it shouldn't be explainable by something else. And then of course, this is important to acknowledge too, is potentially suicidal thoughts or thoughts of self-harm could also be in there. And that can be insidious for people. Like sometimes it can take people by surprise and not something that they've ever experienced before. So those would be more of the red flag symptoms in some extreme situations.
Mm-hmm. And are there varying degrees of some of those sort of, suicidal thoughts or ideations that people may have, right? So maybe they're not experiencing things on the, I have a plan, I have I have a plan, right? Kind of piece. Obviously there's ways of having some of those thoughts or considerations like lower down on that scale. Can you give us some examples of some thoughts that might cross people's minds that actually kind of fall inside that realm?
Definitely. Yeah. One of the big ones that I hear often when I ask that question is, like I'm not really having suicidal thoughts, but something that's coming up often for me is thoughts it would just be better if I didn't wake up in the morning, or it would just be better if there was some kind of catastrophic event and I wasn't here. Be better if I just didn't have to wake up from going to sleep. And that's common, I would say. Another some examples otherwise would be things like, maybe like restricting food. That could be a form of self-harm, or feeling like you're not worthy of consuming food. That's another common one with our high prevalence of disordered eating that's happening. I'd say those are the common ones that I see for sure.
It's interesting, and I don't really know where this falls, but we are going to talk a little bit about mental health in the pandemic. The number
Yes.
of patients that I've had during like the throes of the pandemic who actually, I'm going to use the word admitted because it would have taken some bravery for them to admit that they got COVID during this time because they felt like their life would be easier if they
Yep.
were sick, if they were hospitalized, if they were. And it was interesting because it started to make me think about this bridge around like self harm and suicidal thoughts that like, I don't know where that fits, right? I don't know where like hoping that you ended up with a like an illness so that you could take like a time out from your life, essentially. I don't know where that fits, but that is something that I have had multiple experiences with over the last year.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, it's interesting to bring up the prevalence through the pandemic. Like we knew it had increased. We didn't have specific data showing the amount. And in the fall, Statistics Canada published that, in the spring of 2020, we were at somewhere around 1 in 5 individuals being depressed. And now fast forward to where we are now, it's 1 in 4. So it's a pretty dramatic increase in people who are screening for depression and anxiety overall.
So I think, and you and I probably both have this goal of wanting people to recognize that like the goal here isn't just like not to have terrible mental health. Like the goal is to actually thrive,
Yes.
right?
Mental wellness is what I like to call it.
Yeah, which is a huge distinction to make, I think, too. And especially as we start to talk about like these nutritional aspects and whatnot, because, so many people just get by with their mental health on a day-to-day basis and don't know what it's like to wake up and feel like super jazzed about their day and what they're doing and passion and joy and all of those like positive emotions that like it's not just not being sad.
It's not. And it's that, you experience things that are pleasurable. You experience joy, you experience happiness. And a lot of times people will report just kind of everything feels very flat, very numb, not experiencing, it's okay to be sad sometimes, but that shouldn't last and persist for an inordinate amount of time. And you should be able to get yourself out of that situation if you need to. And I think those are some of the things that a lot of times people just really understate overall. They're just like, I'm fine. It's fine. It is what it is. This is what it is. I don't want to take medication. So there's no real other option for me. So I'm just going to kind of like power truck forward here, which is really worsens outcomes in the long run, definitely. Because I think the piece here is that women are often very disinclined to get support and they don't want to. There's a shame piece around medication. And oftentimes people will say, well, that seems like the easy way out. Like, I don't feel like I need something to get me out of this. But I always like to contextualize it that, medication or whatever intervention you're going to choose can be a bridge to getting you to the place where you can get more support, you can do more lifestyle pieces, you can actually move forward. And the medication or intervention can just be that opportunity.
Because I think people understand that depression isn't just a serotonin deficiency, right? And if we do look at the medication, that can feel like that's what we're saying, right? If we are
Yes.
looking at adding medication that just does a small chemical step in your brain. And one of the ways that I will frame that medication conversation for patients is like what people don't realize is the longer that they live in this sort of state of like mental unwellness or depression, the harder it is for them to recover over time, right? And we know that if the brain is in that state for a long time, that it changes.
Yes, it definitely does. And it just becomes harder and harder to move out of it. And you're going to need more and more support to move out of it. And yeah, I would agree that I think at this point are very clear, and hopefully everyone is very clear that, it's not necessarily a serotonin deficiency at all. That's one of many, many, many theories on what is potentially impacting mood. One of the other ways that I describe it to patients about medications and potentially serotonin impacting medications being helpful is there's some really new research coming out that a lot of those SSRIs or serotonin medications actually are anti-inflammatory, which is really interesting. And so there's this role potentially that mood symptoms in general are maybe an inflammatory symptom happening in the brain. And so those medications can really actually impact that inflammation. And when I frame it that way, that, this can be helpful from many perspectives, a lot of times people are a little bit more interested in exploring that option.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that as we move through the conversation. But you had mentioned this just before we hit record. You used the word threshold, um, and that we've often set this bar really high for when we would seek care and support for our mood. It's like, if I had suicidal thoughts, then I would get care. If I couldn't get out of bed, then maybe I would consider going on medication. If my anxiety was so debilitating it put me in the hospital, then I would consider meds. And yet there is so much living happening like underneath that threshold that is still not ideal.
Definitely not. And I think I hope people listening to this conversation will be able to shift their mindset on that a little bit, that it is important to get help before you get to all those places overall. And then, the other thing that I like to framework it out for depression is that there's, behavioral interventions. So that could be things like lifestyle pieces, like moving your body, getting a counselor or a therapist, which I recommend everybody does, just to have that on hand. And then also like the biochemical options. So medications or nutrients or potentially herbal medicine too. There's a whole bunch of options that can be explored.
So let's talk a little bit about nutrition. So what, like in your opinion, what are some of the like foundational things about nutrition that have an impact on mood?
Yeah. So as we were chatting about before we hit record, I would say the biggest thing time and time again that I see impacting women's mood is like a protein deficiency in their diet through and through. Like the biggest thing that we see impacting mood and energy is just not fueling accordingly throughout the day from a protein perspective. And I always like to describe to patients that, well, protein is all of your amino acids and your building blocks for your entire body. And that includes your neurotransmitters. So, like things like serotonin, things like dopamine. And if you're not consuming enough protein across the day, and especially I would say in the first half of the day, you are setting yourself up for definitely having a lower mood overall. Is that, you obviously see the same thing, I would say.
I do see the same thing. And it's funny when I remember this when I was in school, that one of our nutritional sciences instructors said, like, if you meet an adolescent, and this was his very, very biased opinion, but it stuck with me. He said, if you meet a young person who has new onset depression, don't ask them like if they're a vegetarian, ask them when they became a vegetarian. And I always thought that was such an interesting when I was in school and I had no frame of reference, right, for that, seeing patients on a day-to-day basis and what protein adequacy and deficiency truly look like, in the real world, right? I was just sitting in a lecture. That really stuck with me, that one, like I call it clinical pearl, I guess, that he gave us. And yet when we do start to look at like the real world, because you can do vegetarian diets beautifully, and you can also eat a grilled cheese and French fries and call that vegetarian as well. We definitely see with those protein restricted diets, whether that's a pattern by choice, whether that's an unintentional pattern, it has a real big impact on patients' mood.
Definitely. And I would say often what I see is that, initially when you transition to a vegan or a vegetarian diet, I feel like, I don't know if you see this as well, but I feel like there's this compensation period where you can kind of you do okay, maybe for like 2-3 months. You're like, okay, I feel good. You're probably eating hopefully more vegetables, probably eating less crap overall. So those are all important things. But then there tends to be this downward trajectory that happens after that period of time where they felt good initially, and then it really they're not feeling the same. And there is just more lethargy, more fatigue overall. And it unfortunately is the vegetarian and vegan diets that are protein deficient that tend to be problematic. And of course, there's ways to do those diets that you are getting adequate amounts of protein. But I would say, there has to be some thought and intention put into that. And if you're not doing it, like we're actually being intentional about getting enough protein, it's very easy to end up in a situation where you're not getting enough protein.
Yeah, you got it. And that time delay, I think it's so tough. And I think this is why we struggle with nutrition and nutrition choices in both directions, right? When we're trying to get people to make healthy decisions about their nutrition, they don't reap the rewards of that for so many days that we just need them to show up and lean in and believe us that eating more vegetables one day will turn around for them and they'll feel better. If everyone felt great after one salad, first of all, you and I would be unemployed. But secondly, everyone would feel so great, right? Because everyone can pull off one salad. And the instant feedback that we got around that would be so helpful. But the
Yes.
opposite is also true, that patients can't see their nutrition as being a consequence, or that their symptoms, sorry, I should say, being a consequence of their nutrition because they made the change a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're like, well, I went vegan last year.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, yeah, but it took a year, right? For it to show up in your health as a problem. It's not one day of protein deficiency and you can't get up off the floor. It's you like repeating the pattern over and over and over again for it to start to show up in your health.
Yes. And I would say, like, contrasting that as well with when we're trying to study nutritional interventions, it's like what you always say, and what I always say too, is that it's unfortunately, we don't get these immediate effects. We have to follow people for really long periods of time to actually see there be changes and in either direction, whether helping or hindering. And we don't generally, the studies do not follow people for that length of time. But, in clinical practice, I see it all the time. And it's always really, yeah, there's this negotiation piece of like, okay, you're going to have to really ramp up your vegetarian sources of protein. And, especially if there's this, well, I don't like those or I don't enjoy those, then there, becomes a negotiation of like, okay, then you maybe need to reconsider the whole situation overall. Like, can you have an egg? How do you feel about fish? Those kind of things, because they're unfortunately quick sources of protein. There's obviously environmental implications, which I'm very aware of, but the health piece does, in my mind, need to come first.
Yeah. And not everybody can thrive on the same plan, right? And I think that's the other piece and we don't know. One thing I would love, right, is there to be this research that would be able for us to flag patients who couldn't do this, right? Who couldn't do the low protein diet and thrive, for us to like find some marker in their blood and be like, ooh, no, you keep that chicken in there. Like we can't, but we just don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are left with sort of anecdotal experience of people experimenting with low protein diets. But because we like to imagine that we're all the same, sometimes you'll see, your coworker in the cubicle beside you eating their plant-based diet and thriving. I mean, truthfully, maybe they're not thriving and they just haven't told you. But you also you can't necessarily just adopt those dietary practices and have it be in your best interest necessarily.
Yes. And I always say there's no one size fits all approach. Like what works for you versus your friend versus your sibling, it's going to be very different across the board. And I think that that's the benefit there. And again, of getting a practitioner and really getting that individualized approach to what is going to work for you on a whole, because it's not going to be the same for everybody. And I agree, there are some people in my practice who, like my grandma, for example, is vegetarian, and she's been vegetarian for probably like nearly 20 years or more. And she's fine. She thrives. There's no problems. And she's really diligent about getting her plant-based sources of protein. But I would say that's not everyone generally.
Mm-hmm. And culturally, if you didn't grow up that way, that is a tough transition to make. And I can say that as the Caucasian podcast host, where if I tried to go vegetarian, my cultural nutritional practices actually don't support those protein like diverse plant-based protein needs. And so people that grow up vegetarian, where their cultural cuisine delivers all of those proteins, that's great. But asking me to cook with lentils is really difficult, right? On a regular basis, I can squeeze them in once or twice a year. But for me to like actually achieve that in my own nutrition would be really difficult. But I am not that different than that population who's watching the Netflix documentary that decides that meat's the devil.
Yes. And I would say too, as if you are eating from a very young age, a vegetarian or a vegan diet, your gut bacteria then really level those things and you're generally going to tolerate them a little bit better. And when I try to get, typical patients coming to me to increase their plant-based sources of protein, they are like, well, I'm going to get more gassy. I'm going to get more digestive upset. I'm like, that just doesn't work for me. Like my partner hates it already. I'm already super gassy. And I'm like, well, yeah, this is a hard turning point for you then, I guess.
But I think what that comes back to, Stephanie, is like we need to make decisions based on like what your overarching health goals actually are, right? Like that's what we're really saying, is that your nutrition plan may not be supporting your mental health at its best, and we shouldn't compromise on your mental health to maintain a specific nutrition practice, because that's not an evidence-based way of supporting you nutritionally actually. There's other nutrients beyond protein though. Like what do you see as being, like, from a deficiency perspective, what's showing up in the mental health space as far as what we know?
Yeah, definitely. So I think some of the bigger things where I would say there's larger amounts of evidence are things like iron, so iron deficiency anemia, or just like suboptimal low iron. You don't have to be anemic in order to qualify for having low iron necessarily. That can impact mood, definitely. Vitamin D is another big one. And then things like omega-3 fatty acids, all of those pieces are, important from a nutritional standpoint, but also we see in population-wide studies, there is this deficiency that can come up. And we don't totally know yet, like, okay, if we give people vitamin D, does that improve their mood? I would say the research is pretty iffy on that at this point. But what we see is there does tend to be a correlation between vitamin D deficiency, for example, and higher prevalence of anxiety and depression.
Yeah, the research on that one I always find so interesting because it's an environmental exposure, right? Vitamin D. And so and I talk to my patients about this too, because I think we find, sometimes we can get excited about vitamin D in the news, about all the various magical things that vitamin D does, when for some populations, it's a surrogate marker for outdoor exercise or just being able to spend time outside in the sun. And if you think about that, like that certainly will have a positive impact on your mood.
Yes, even 5 minutes of going outside and doing what we would call forest bathing or going for a walk in nature is enough to boost mood for many people. And so, of course, that's a surrogate marker for vitamin D if you are lucky enough to live in an environment where you get year-round sun exposure, which unfortunately neither Jordan or I get.
No. It's funny. I remember, and this was many years ago. So I'm going to admit to using a tanning bed many years
Wow.
ago. Yep, I'm going to admit it. But I remember like it was winter and I was going away on a trip. And so I decided to do some like low dose tanning before I went in a tanning bed. And I remember like it was the dead of winter. And I remember when this thing clicked on, right? And the lights came on. And like instantly my brain was like, oh, I didn't realize I was so sad until like this moment where all of a sudden I'm not.
Yes. Well, exactly. Right. Like there is a huge, which is why, one of the big things that I've actually been recommending this year is getting the light boxes or the SAD lights. They're awesome. And actually in studies comparing use compared to antidepressants and just for overall mood boosting effects, if you are, especially with the time change, it being dark, like the sun's still coming up here right now. Those are all things that negatively impact mood, is just lack of sun exposure overall. So I love recommending those. It's a little safer than a tanning bed, Jordan.
It's way safer. I know. And I haven't been in a tanning bed since that moment, but I also use a light therapy device, which I do feel like makes a huge difference, just my personal experience with it. But the research on it's pretty cool, right?
Yeah, it's amazing. I just think it's one of the things I always tell people. It doesn't have to be this like regimented thing where you wake up in the morning and sit in front of this box for 20 to 30 minutes. You can kind of have it on beside you while you're getting ready, like bring it into the kitchen, bring it into the bathroom while you do your hair and makeup, or if you start work right away when you wake up, kind of put it on beside you at your desk. It's just such an easy thing to kind of add into the mix, which I like. Easy. Anything that's easy becomes more doable for people.
Totally. And I do think sometimes when we start to talk about those self-care practices, especially for patients that are struggling with their mental health, that, the moment we start to talk about like, okay, it would be great if you could meditate. It would be great if you could, use a light box. It would be great if, and then they start to imagine this like a very zen human being having this brilliant morning routine that starts at 5 a.m. and they just don't feel like that person, right? Because they're not even their best version of themselves right now. And yet they can view some of those self-care pieces as being like just impossible, even though they're 5 minutes long. So I really like offering that sense of like flexibility and compassion around how you do it.
Yeah. And just however simple it can be, honestly, generally it's going to lead to being better overall. And I think that people, exactly, when I describe like, okay, you need to go for a 30-minute exercise, make sure you got your bedtime routine so you're getting 8 hours of sleep, eat 3 really solid great meals a day, like it's just not going to happen. And I think that's often where sometimes practitioners go wrong, is giving too many recommendations overall, and it just massive unrealistic expectations. And then it actually just worsens the situation because the person feels defeated and like they couldn't meet the goals, and why can't they do the things, and they beat themselves up more. And so I just, starting simple is often going to be the best way to go.
For sure. And I think that just lends itself to why the practitioner relationship is so important, right? Because you really become sort of the strategist, right? We can probably, even the layperson can probably name 10 things that are helpful to support mood, but it's like the implementation and the strategy for how people move forward is the part that they are really needing support with.
Yeah. And then like getting that feedback from the patient. Like, does this seem doable? How does this fit into your life? Will you be able to like succeed on this? And, sometimes it's very simple. Like, we need to start with you, like, bathing a few times a week, brushing your teeth twice a day, like getting like something in you food wise at least once a day. And that's just, go outside and sit on a bench for 10 minutes, right? Like it's got to sometimes start really, really low. And I think if you don't know the person sitting in front of you really well, then that becomes very challenging to actually give those recommendations to the individual.
Absolutely. It makes me think of I had a patient within the last year, and I was like, okay, so like step one, nutrition wise, is I want you to have a boost every day for breakfast. And she was like, you're a naturopath. And I was like, I know. And she's like, that's what you want me to do? You want me to have a boost? And I was like, yeah, that seems like the most doable idea so far when we're talking about nutrition. Does it feel doable for you? And she's like, oh yeah, like that feels really doable. I'm just amazed that that's all you want me to do. um and it was such a like, I mean, that's obviously I had that idea, and so that was like my standard practice of working with that patient population in the first place. But you can just imagine that that was like not her impression of what the treatment plan was going to look like, and in a way that also made me a little bit sad and discouraged at the state of the health and wellness industry when we're working with patients who are struggling with their mental health, because I think they're often leaving those appointments with like a very long list of shit they need to do.
Definitely. And then it's just like, okay, we're going to make this like super complicated smoothie with like 15 different ingredients. You're going to add all these special seeds and this special oil. And like, you got to go buy all the things. You got to go to the store, buy the things, find the things I'm recommending, and then like bring it home. Make sure you got a good blender and then like drink it. It tastes awful, but like you better drink the whole thing. And then like, you're going to have to do that every day. And they're just like, oh my gosh, like I can't do that. Contrasting that with a boost. I don't know if it's available out east, but we have what's called Rumble here in BC. And so it's actually designed by a naturopathic doctor. It's very equivalent to a boost, but it's got a little bit better ingredients. That's my go-to recommendation because, the person leaves, they do that, they get a sense of accomplishment. And then because they're actually getting some proper fuel happening, then all of a sudden, oh, they can go for the walk. Oh, they can, sit in front of the light box. They can do some of those things that are going to probably have a bigger impact overall. But if you start with the complicated smoothie recipe that you got to make at like 6:30 after you meditated for 30 minutes, it's just not going to happen.
Even I sometimes can't manage to fit half of the ingredients in my smoothie. And it is like a 4 ingredient smoothie, and I will miss putting stuff in there.
Me too.
Um, so there's the protein piece, and we probably, would love if patients kind of would self audit, I'm going to say, for how much protein they are getting in a day. In general, when I start to give that feedback, I'm like, okay, so you said you had a bagel, you said you had this, like, and I can ballpark, that patients are really under fueling in that department. That's not a difficult number for people to figure out in their life if they just add it up.
Yeah. And I always say, I think I maybe got this from you, is just maybe looking at your plate and looking at your meal, being able to point to the protein source. Like if that's where we're starting, great. Because I really want to make sure that you at least can identify that you're getting that with whatever you're putting in you at all opportunities.
And avocado does not have enough.
No,
No.
none.
So protein is an easy self-assessment, but probably needs some support, like as far as like figuring out strategy for how to get that in. Vitamin D, and I know we feel the same way about this, is something that really should be tested.
Yes, definitely. And I think that it's unfortunately not covered. Oftentimes, at least in BC, we don't get free vitamin D testing. Okay, ODs too, none. Yeah. So it's a really well spent $65, I feel, because then you actually get some important information. Like, are you massively deficient and we need to throw like 10,000 IUs a day at you for like months? Or are you actually okay and we just need to try to maintain you where you're at right now? And because it's a fat soluble vitamin, there's a whole bunch of safety concerns if you take too much of it. So, which I would say I've actually seen a lot of that happening lately, like for the first time ever too. I'm seeing like these massive elevations in vitamin D levels. I think it happened twice last week where I'm calling the patient being like, the 10,000 a day that you were taking for the last like year is too much. You need to walk that back. And it's just really important to get guidance from your practitioner about how much is appropriate.
Yeah, I've had the same thing, and I think my impression is it's coming from some of the like the news on COVID and vitamin D, is that people are self-prescribing. I've never had patients be toxic, maybe once in my like previous 12 years, and then this year I think we've had 10 people that were self-prescribing, like, really heroic doses of vitamin D because they read that it's good. And it's one of those things where, just because like some is good doesn't mean a lot is better. So testing is really valuable.
Yes, it totally is. And I think that also getting some guidance on like, there's even, you could just take vitamin D dosing once a week, for example, or you might only need it. There's some studies where they only dose it once a month. Like you can have that real intricate conversation with your practitioner. Cause sometimes too, like walking out of an appointment with like a laundry list of supplements that you need to take is also, I agree, think from many perspectives is not effective, but especially when you're dealing with someone struggling with mental health, it's just not doable. So you want to be able to get that specific recommendation of how frequently do you need to take this? And, if taking something every day doesn't seem doable, then you can actually do it a little bit differently than that.
And then you alluded to testing for iron, which I think is a valuable piece as well. What other nutrients? Are there any other nutrients that we should be thinking about or looking at when it comes to supporting mental health? Where's the research at with fish oil these days?
Yeah, fish oil is an interesting one. I would say like it's interesting because it does really show that it can be beneficial for mood, but it's often over longer periods of time. Like, so this is the problem is people are like, well, I've been taking omega-3s for like a month and I did nothing. And it's like, well, no, actually, you're probably going to need to take that for, at least 3 months before we're going to see it being dramatic benefits overall. I think likely the reason why omega-3s work is back to that anti-inflammatory piece that we were talking about before. Omega-3s are one of the most effective like nutraceuticals that we have to work to reduce inflammation. And it's probably having somewhat of an anti-inflammatory effect in the brain. And then also our bodies have a high composition of omega-3s in general. And so that's why the omega-3s can be useful. And then there's a whole bunch of pieces around like the quality of the omega-3. Like if you're just getting a random one that's 100 milligrams, it's not going to do anything. You need to be, the studies are clear. It has to be much high doses of what we would call EPA, which is a specific type of omega-3. And again, over a longer period of time.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's funny because patients will get, kind of the Costco brand or Costco
I was going to
equivalent
say
of
that,
their fish
but
oil.
I didn't know if
I'm
I
not
should.
saying in a bad way. It's fine to buy your supplements from Costco. It's the dose that we're after, right? As practitioners, and typically with fish oil, if and I don't mean to equate it against the cost, but typically for fish oil, it should be about 30 to $40 per month, right? And if you found a deal on it, then the dose in the capsule is maybe less than what is necessary, and you're going to have to take more, which puts you back up into the $30 to $40 per month range again. So it's one of those ones that it's hard to cut corners, because even if it looks like that's one of the labels that I find is the most misleading out there is fish oil, because it'll say it's 1,000 milligram capsule.
I know.
And then when
it
you
kills me.
turn it around, it's 1,000 milligrams of like oil in there. But the actual active ingredients that we're after often are a fraction of that 1,000. And those numbers are the ones that we're the most interested in. The Kirkland one is a perfect example where it's 1,000 milligram capsule. But if you read the label, it's like 180 milligrams of EPA or 120 milligrams of DHA, something like that. So it's really like a third of the capsule has any usable fish oil in the capsule. And so the number of capsules that you now need to take in order to hit a therapeutic dose means you should have just bought a different one.
Yes. And then that's the one that I'm often like circling back on. Like, and now with virtual, it's awesome. So I'm like, go grab your bottle and let's actually like walk through this together, because they're often very surprised. Like they'll say, yeah, it's 120 milligrams of EPA per capsule. I'm like, okay, you need 2,000 of those. So you're going to actually have to take 20 capsules of that one per day. So, and that's just going to not be realistic.
No, and now it's not a deal. Now it's not a deal.
No, it's not a deal. And that's why, again, unfortunately, it's not something you can cut corners with. And it is a costly intervention, of course. And that's the downside, right? As medications generally are covered by extended benefit plans or public health drug plans. And unfortunately, a lot of the nutraceutical options are not. Maybe one day that will change, but they're not for right now. And so you really got to add up like, okay, this is how much I want to spend. And this is my health budget for some of these interventions.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's where working with someone can make such a huge difference, because they can lay out that, kind of that hierarchy essentially to say like, okay, vitamin D, you're truly deficient. It's, cost wise fractional. Omega 3s, we maybe have like pretty solid data, especially if someone is a low fish eater, which kind of brings up that whole other piece that if you're deficient in omega 3s, like I think that certainly is warranted for us to maybe consider that nutrient. Maybe that's second in line, as we come looking at nutrients, assuming that you don't have any other like massive deficiencies like iron. And really like beyond that, it's probably icing on the cake, right? Would you agree?
Yes, I definitely would for sure. And I think it really just comes back to, again, like, okay, maybe an omega-3 supplement might be okay, but, trying to steer you more towards a Mediterranean diet overall, you're going to naturally include more of those foods like nuts and seeds and fish that get more of those omega-3s overall. And that's going to also be very beneficial across the board in general.
So lastly, like, I just want to hear your opinion on, there are some botanical medicines that have some evidence for various, mental health challenges. And then we have medication. So how are you coaching your patients around decision making between like all of these pieces actually? Like, do you have a framework that you're moving through to help people make these decisions? Because it feels like a very difficult one, even though I think for you and I, like, we can be so pragmatic about the use of medication. I'm like, well, it's easy. This is what we need. But it does feel like a very value-based decision for so many people, and they do need to weigh those pros and cons, et cetera. How do you help people navigate those decisions around medication, botanicals, or everything else we've talked about?
Yeah. So generally, I mean, it always really starts with a really good assessment and trying to determine severity of depression or severity of anxiety and how the person, how much support a person feels like they need. And so it's often very clear in my mind when we need more help and when we need to actually onboard some more additional things. And as I mentioned before, whatever it's going to be a bridge. And it doesn't necessarily need to be, there's a fear like, oh, I'm going to be on this for 10 years. Like I'm going to have to take this medication forever. It's like, well, no, let's, start with 6 to 9 months and kind of go from there. But I think I obviously it does come back to cost for people. Like, are you prepared to pay money out of pocket for X herb or nutrient for the next 9 months, or would you prefer the medication that's going to be covered by the drug plan? I also think it's important to acknowledge that sometimes you just need to do something. Like it often doesn't matter, and that's the real amazing thing is you just need to make a decision that you're going to take something to help your mood, and that the sheer fact of taking that intervention and doing it day in and day out, there's a very high placebo effect when we study depression across the board. And it's just because of that piece of needing to do something. And so, from a botanical medicine standpoint, there's, really only a few herbs that are super standing out across the research as being effective. Things like St. John's wort probably have a role. Curcumin or turmeric has a role. Saffron has a role. There's maybe a couple others that I would turn to, but those would be the three right now that are kind of standing out like in the sun as being beneficial. And then there's also some nutrients, as we mentioned, things like omega-3s, S-adenosylmethionine, SAMe is one of the ones that's more effective. Folic acid or methylfolate are also potentially useful. But above that, medications are going to be an option. And I think just talking through side effects and actually being able to spend 30 minutes being like, hey, this is what you're going to expect. And this is the time frame with which we're going to see benefits happening. It's unfortunately not going to be overnight. It's probably going to take a month before we're going to start seeing some benefit overall. But this is the expectation that you should have. And this is how long you're going to be able to be on it. And there's some interesting research too, just if you spend more time talking to people about the side effects and walking them through their expectations, it goes better. Like they stay on the medication longer. Their symptoms improve more and all those perspectives.
Yeah, that's so valuable, Stephanie, because it's even just, reminding patients that if they are feeling rushed or if they're feeling like they're left to Google information, that's already a bit of a red flag that they're set up, right? Like even if they decide to lean in and do the thing or whatever was written on the slip of paper that they took home, but if they were left with those feelings of like not having a plan or not seeing what the next steps are or not understanding what to expect and are kind of left to look it up on their own, that we're already kind of setting them up to, I don't want to use the word fail, but have a lesser outcome than is possible if we have that more integrative approach around supporting mood. And you already gave us so many other things other than, and you and I are both pro medication, but you've given us so many other things beyond medication that people can look at to support their outcome. But the therapeutic relationship piece, I think, is so important.
Yes, it is. And my partner is a clinical psychologist, and I was talking to him about this the other day, and he was like, I was very happy that he said this, but he was like, naturopathic doctors are really well poised to support mood and mental health in general, because you guys actually get to spend way more time with people. You take the time to get to know them, find out what motivates them, find out how to support them, and you just develop that solid relationship. And at the end of the day, that's actually what matters most.
What's your final lasting message here, Stephanie? I know this is an area that you're incredibly passionate about. If you thought about what you wanted to leave our listeners with as sort of the final thoughts about this topic, what would you want to share?
I would want to share that I would just encourage everyone to reflect on if they need support and encourage you to start that conversation with your practitioner sooner than at the end of the line when you are doing really poorly and not getting out of bed. So before that happens, seek help, start the conversation, because at least then it's, you're in those 10 to 15 minute appointments that you get with your primary care provider, they're getting to know you, they're getting an understanding of the situation so that if and when it gets worse, they're there and it's not a surprise.
How can our listeners find you?
Yeah, good question. You can follow me on Instagram at Dr. Stephanie Bayliss, and the same thing on Facebook.
Awesome. And I highly recommend following Stephanie. She gives out a ton of great information, all things like PMS, perimenopause, menopause. We didn't even dive into the hormonal stuff, but you understand that population so well. And it's such a neat connection between supporting people through their mental health and wellness, but also through those hormonal shifts. I highly recommend that you go follow her. And we'll put all the links, Stephanie, for your Instagram and for your website and everything in the show notes. And so you can find Stephanie if you're in the BC area. You do virtual care for people in BC.
Yes, I definitely do. Can see people all over the province in BC.
Amazing. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Thank you for having me, Jordan. This has been awesome.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.